Thank you very much. It's good to be back here in Brno. I'll just mention real quick that my grandfather studied here in Brno over 100 years ago, not at Masaryk University, but there used to be a big textile technology institute here, and he studied here. He came from Slovakia, so I have a personal connection. I've been thinking about metal and Jews pretty much from the moment I started getting into metal studies. In fact, it's quite nice that Keith is the keynote speaker here because his online writings about metal and Jews were one of the things that first inspired my exploration of this topic. Till now, my focus has been on two aspects of this broad subject. The first, Jews who create quote-unquote Jewish metal, and other Jews who are the audience for this small corner of metal. And the second, anti-Semitism in metal, particularly in NSBM. But reading the call for paper for this conference suggested to me another way of approaching Jews and metal that is, of course, not entirely disconnected from these other two subjects, and yet is not covered by them. That is, of thinking of Jews or Judaism as components in metal's language of transgression. To put it crudely, and yes, I know this is very simplistic, although metal has become more global, it emerged in the context of a Christian-dominated cultural environment and developed its language of transgression in opposition to Christian values and symbols. Christianity has long treated Jews and Judaism as one of its primary opposites, often portraying Jews as the antithesis of Christians, a relationship that is often conveyed in its symbolic language. So I chose to illustrate this with this cross that I assume most of you know. It's from the Charles Bridge in Prague. I chose it not just because it's relatively close, but also this cross, as some of you might know, and I gave you some language that I found from the Radio Prague website, explains a little bit. So originally the cross didn't have the gold decoration on it. And in the late 17th century, a Jew was walking on the bridge and some Christians accused him of blaspheming the cross. And he was put on trial, him and his, it doesn't say, but also his colleague, and they were convicted and they were fined a hefty amount of payment. And with that payment, the gold addition was made. You can see the Hebrew added. It says Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Adonai Tzvaot, and you have the translation in the text there. And basically, it doesn't only symbolize part of the crucifixion story from the earliest aspects of Christianity, but also, as it were, more recent anti-Semitism. And I chose a cross because we all know the various ways that metal manipulates crosses in its symbolism. So as metal draws its ideology and symbolism of transgression in relationship to Christianity, it makes sense to think that Jews and Judaism will be involved in some way. Or to put it another way, that is still crude but helpful, Jews were often deeply connected with Satan in Christian thought. And so as metal embraces to various degrees of sincerity and depth, Satan and Satanism, again, we have a connection to Judaism. Or to put it another way that is a bit more complex. Jason Leaf argues that metal's opposition to Christianity in particular is grounded in the way it functions as a form of pure sacred that provides the religious guarantee of the ideology of Western culture. There is a particular role to metal's negation of Christianity specifically, because of the particular role Christianity plays in the West. This is true on a surface level, where even in secular Western countries, the pace of life, for example, the yearly calendar is constructed by the rhythm of the Christian one, but also on a deeper level, where Christianity has sunk into the foundation of the institutions of even so-called secular states. In the same place, Leaf goes on to say, from the beginning, the metal subculture has functioned as a type of remainder of Western society, meaning it signifies elements of human experience that are repressed and unaccounted for by the dominant ideology of Western culture. And this can be tied to David Nierenberg, who in his massive book, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, argues that Christianity's opposition to Judaism is foundational for Western culture. So basically, what I'm saying here is that Jews and Judaism, even when not present, for example, in England when they were expelled in the Middle Ages functioned as, for a lot of Christianity in the West, in historical Europe, as the repressed. And while one might quibble with some of Nuremberg's points here and there in his big book, it's hard to disagree that Christianity's positing of Jews/Judaism as its other is a central constitutive element of Western culture and is relevant to thinking about metal. I can easily illustrate this by pointing to the examples of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, two metal bands whose transgressive leanings are signaled by adopting in their very names symbols or tropes that Christianity views as anathema, whose origins stem from Christianity's troubled relationship to Judaism. Right, so Judas of Judas Priest is the famous one who betrayed Jesus, sold him to the Romans for 30 pieces of silver, and becomes a symbol often in Christianity of a type of Jew. And then Black Sabbath, even before Christianity, the Saturday was connected to Saturn and to Satan and to evil, and Christianity certainly built on that connection when associating the Sabbath with Jews, and that's how the witches' Sabbath idea comes up. So it kind of, you can see how it goes. That this phenomenon is so ingrained in metal has led there to be an internet rumor that the band Pantera is named after a Jewish tradition that Jesus' real father was the son of a Roman soldier, who according to this tradition was named something like Pantera. So this tradition is found in Jewish sources going back to the Talmud, and it's a way of sort of countering the Christian idea of the virgin birth. No, Mary wasn't a virgin and wasn't impregnated by the Holy Spirit. Actually, she committed adultery with a Roman soldier, and so on and so forth. But then now, in the 20th century, this rumor that this Pantera of the band is drawn from this Jewish tradition. In fact, searching an internet source to show you examples of this rumor, I stumbled upon the following from 2014. That explicitly links the name Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, and Pantera. So this pastor builds on the idea that I explained, that Judas Priest and Black Sabbath have this connection to anti-Christianity, and says, oh, also Pantera is there. And while, of course, this pastor is completely wrong about the etymology of Pantera, his underlying logic, as it were, logic, that both Black Sabbath and Judas Priest are names that are based on inverting Christian ideals, and that this goes back to Christianity's negative relationship with Judaism, makes some sense. In the longer article, it makes explicit that these are Jewish conspiracies that are being alluded to in these names. That is the pastor is claiming. Now, it could be argued that neither the bands themselves nor the majority of their fans associate either name with its connection to Judaism. And it's only scholars, metal-hating pastors, and nerdy Jewish fans who might make this association. And that's valid. But that's precisely the point. Christianity's anti-Jewishness has become so embedded in Western culture that any negation of Western culture via negation of Christianity will invoke Jewishness on some level, even when it is not done intentionally or consciously. In the same vein as the examples of these band names, we can include Celtic Frost's song Ein Elohim, whose Hebrew title translates as "There is no God," and whose lyrics depict a God who is passionately inflamed against his or his people's enemies and sinful flesh. This imagery, coupled with the use of the term tetragrammatron, the Greek euphemism for the five-lettered name of God that in Hebrew is spelled with 5 letters, Yud He Vav He, really establishes that this song is about a fairly stereotypical image of the God of the Old Testament, who is at least implicitly set against the kinder, gentler God of the New Testament. A similar example can be found in the name of the American black metal band Mizmor. This one-man band was started by Liam Neighbors, who goes by ALN, when he was, quote, a Christian wrestling with his faith. He says of it, or people quote him as saying, the one-man black metal project was intended as a tool, a means of interrogating his relationship with God through art. In this context, he chose a name that ties to the Bible, but specifically, at least for him, not the Bible from the evangelical Christian tradition he was leaving or struggling with. And I say leaving because eventually he ends up leaving, but when he started the project, he wasn't clear to himself that what his relationship was going to be. In an interview, he explained that he chose the name Mizmor because it refers to the religious singing of the Bible, specifically to the book of Psalms, where many a psalm is called a Mizmor. But also, by choosing a word in Hebrew and referencing the Old Testament, he was avoiding or actively rejecting Latin and the New Testament. And this is his own words on that. This use of Hebrew carried through into many of his early releases. So you already saw the album cover for Yod, which came out in 2016, and that's named after the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In 2018, he released a collection of various materials that did not appear on in his previous albums, calling it Mishlei, the Hebrew name for the book of Proverbs. And another collection of even earlier material is called Iyov, which is the Hebrew name for Job. All three of these biblical books referenced in these titles are from what Christians call the poetic and wisdom books of the Bible, of the Old Testament. A section of the Bible tied to artistic expression, philosophical musings about the nature of the divine and its plan for the world. And in the case of Job, an extended meditation on theodicy and the nature of faith. All themes that connect to Mizmor's oeuvre. As he explains when talking about the first album, which was called Mizmor, it's more of a, why are you doing this to me thing, you know, which is where the name came from. It's very indicative of the Psalms, wrestling with God. These examples from Celtic Frost and Mizmor illustrate one important element of how metal works with its symbols, and this applies not just to Judaism. While both cases involve inverting Christian values in a way, the God of the Old Testament, or indeed the Old Testament itself, becoming a tool for either rejecting or struggling with Christianity, they reify a Christian way of looking at things. The opposition between Christian New Testament versus Jewish Old Testament is stable. It's just inverted, that one is considered better than the other versus the Christian way of looking at things. I want to pause with exploring examples and introduce an important caveat to thinking about this issue. And I'm going to explore this caveat stated differently by three scholars, because while similar, they have slightly different implications that I believe are important to keep in mind when thinking about metal's use of Jews or Jewish stuff as a symbol. I'm going to begin with Anna Katharina Hopflinger's talk that she gave at this conference last year. In Do They Really Mean It? 5 Functions of the Reception of Religious Symbols in Black Metal, she notes that while the original meaning attached to a religious symbol might be at play in why it's chosen for metal, or specifically black metal, which was her focus, once these symbols enter metal, they take on a life of their own, as it were, one that communicates differently to members of the metal community. For this reason, we can't simply interpret the use of Hebrew or Old Testament terms in the context of black metal or metal as replicating a meaning it might have to non-members of the metal community. So whatever Jews and Judaism symbolize for Christianity, while that might be the reason they become a useful symbol in metal, that doesn't mean they maintain the same meaning once they become part of it. This, I think, can be neatly illustrated with the way ALN uses the biblical words, or even Hebrew letter, in his work. While as noted, he chose Mizmor because the tone of many of the Psalms fits with his struggle of faith, and this applies to Iyov and Mishlei, there is a way where the use of at least one of the Hebrew in his works, or some of the Hebrew in his works, can be seen as marking something other than its original meaning as words in a language. So if you can see on the bottom there, 2 of the tracks on Mishlei are named in Hebrew. But he says when talking about them that he can't even read the Hebrew himself. So he knows what the meaning was, but he can't pronounce. So the words become almost symbols rather than actual words with meaning. So they transform into something else when he uses them, and for people who are looking at the tracks, metal fans. Robert Walser makes a similar point to Anna Katharina's, but with a different setup in his book, Running with the Devil. In discussing Iron Maiden's use of symbols in their works, he says, I'm going to try to pick up pace a little bit. Christianity, alchemy, myth, astrology, the mystique of vanished Egyptian dynasties, all are available in the modern world as sources of power and mystery. Such eclectic constructions of power, which might usefully be called postmodern, are possible only because they are not perceived as tied to strict historical context. All can be consulted, appropriated, and combined, used to frame questions and answers about life and death. The cross, whether inverted or upright, the pyramid, the Kabbalistic tree of life, or the tetragrammaton are viewed as symbols of power and mystery, but are detached from their strict historical and cultural moorings, even before metal becomes involved with them. They are there for the metal creator, the lyricist, the album decorator, the shirt maker, to appropriate and invest with new meanings. Judaism and Jewishness might be an important source of symbolic meaning for metal, and part of that might come from the relationship metal has to Christianity, but at the same time, in the postmodern reality, we should also be aware that the meaning is on many levels unmoored from its historical context. Finally, in a very similar way to Walzer, but with a specific focus on Christianity, in Matthew P. Unger's Sound, Symbol, Sociality, the aesthetic experience of extreme metal music, he traces extreme metal's aesthetic language of symbols back to a break in Western culture, marked with Nietzsche's Death of God. Following the work of Paul Ricoeur, Unger argues that post-secular aesthetics is the background to the symbolic constitution of extreme metal. The key to this is Ricoeur's argument that the famous hermeneutics of suspicion, Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx, have transformed religion irredeemably and have led to the collapse of meta-narratives dictated by religion. So if one of the meta-narratives of Christianity is a certain relationship to Judaism, and that has collapsed post-Nietzsche and post this secularization, the relationship of Christianity to Judaism that metal is building on is unstable. The common point from all these three very different observations about metal and religious symbols is that we can't assume a stable relationship of values, even if it is an inverted one, that carries on from Western Christianity into metal, when thinking of the place or role of Jews in this matrix. So to come to some preliminary conclusions. First, since metal's language of transgression is developed in relationship, at least at first, to Christianity, and since Christianity's ideas about transgression and blasphemy, etc., very much involve Jews and Judaism, in order to fully understand metal's vocabulary and symbolism, we need to include a consideration of Christianity's relationship to Judaism. Second, this consideration includes what I think of as a surface study, examples of explicit references, and as well a deeper place of the role of Judaism in Western culture. And finally, that we need to be aware of the change that I mentioned, that symbols don't work consistently in metal as they do outside of metal. And of course, here I haven't even begun to touch on what happens in metal made in non-Western cultural contexts, where the history and symbolism of Jews and Judaism work differently. I know that this has been somewhat fragmentary and clearly an idea that is in the progress of development. Thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions or thoughts. Thank you.